us right now to talk about what's in the GOP's latest stimulus proposal and what it's going to take to get a deal done is Ohio Senator Rob Portman. And Senator, thank you for being here. You are somebody who I think is a voice of reason and who always comes pretty much straight down the middle with these things. This is a big battle. You have both sides that are digging in at this point. You heard what Eamon said about what swing voters, likely voters in swing states are saying. What do you think right now? Where would you feel comfortable, and do you stand with McConnell on this?
I think the McConnell proposal is a good starting point, Becky. It has $1 trillion of new spending, which, as Joe just indicated, is an incredible amount of money. It used to be a lot, still is. It also addresses all the key issues. It addresses our healthcare system, including more money for research, more money for antiviral medications, for the vaccine, also for testing. It has significant funding for our schools, in fact, slightly more than was in the original Democrat proposal, so that our schools can reopen safely. It's got money for employment. One thing I like about it is it has some tax incentives for people to hire folks, because right now I think that's important to get people back to work and get them back to work safely. It also has a tax incentive to create a safe workplace. So if you're spending money on things like plexiglass shields or more PPE or more hand sanitizer or testing or thermometers, you can actually get a tax credit for that. So there's a lot of good in this bill. And I think on the unemployment insurance front, the 70% of wages is something that a lot of folks would appreciate, including a lot of people who were just polled. If they were told that if you lose your job, you can have a 70% wage replacement, that's generous. That's more generous than the states provide currently. And that's where the McConnell proposal ends up. As you know, I've supported in the past this return to work bonus. That's what I've been promoting. If you have the number that's so high that you're making significantly more on unemployment insurance than you are at work, then you need to have a return to work bonus also. But if you have the 70% of replacement of wages, I think that's a reasonable place to start.
In terms of standing with McConnell, do you agree with him with what he said yesterday about how, look, this is not going to happen unless you have the business liability issue taken away, that he will not bring this bill to the floor? None of this will happen unless you issue immunity from corporate responsibility or liability when it comes to COVID.
Well, listen, he's been very clear about that from the start, and of course we hear about that back home a lot. By the way, we don't just hear it from businesses. We hear it from school teachers. We hear it from healthcare professionals. We hear it certainly from people who are running restaurants who are saying, if someone gets sick, and it may come from anywhere, but if I get a lawsuit, this will put me over the top and could bankrupt me. So you have to have something here, I think, and I think Democrats acknowledge there needs to be something here. The question is the details. How does it work? How does it work with state laws that are already in effect? But I think it's a misnomer to say it's just about big business. It's really more about small business and all these other entities, including nonprofits.
Senator, again, though, I think a lot of it comes in the wording, as you just alluded to. Is there a way to do this, to say that as long as businesses are following the rules, doing the best that they can be, given the guidance, that they wouldn't be held liable, but at the same time, not necessarily have as high of a threshold or as high of a bar as it seems is said in the current language that's there, that basically says unless they can prove that you intentionally tried to give someone coronavirus or COVID, that you're not going to be held responsible? Maybe that's where the compromise comes down?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think following the CDC guidelines should apply to that as well as to the tax provisions we talked about. I mean, we want people to return to work, and we want them to return to work safely, and there's a way to do both. Again, that's why I like some of the provisions in this legislation that actually incentivize a safe workplace, including providing a credit and offset to the payroll tax if you do make your workplace safer. So I think that has to be part of it, and I think that's part of the compromise to get to something that makes sense. And it has to be COVID-19 related, of course.
When you talk to the leaders in either party, they're going to lay out their case. They're going to say, here's what we have, and we're not going to negotiate. This is our stance on this. They're not going to negotiate on the airwaves. But what do you actually hear when you talk to your colleagues on both sides of the aisle? How close is this to something getting done? How much urgency do you sense from your colleagues in terms of getting something done quickly?
Well, I think there's a lot more common ground than would appear from the public comments that have been made by both sides, and that's because McConnell put out a very generous package, $1 trillion, and it has pretty much every issue covered that's in the Democrat package, just not as much money, and it doesn't have the extraneous matters that are in the Democrat package that don't relate to COVID-19. I will say on the big issue this week, Becky, which is the $600 additional federal benefit on top of the state benefit for unemployment insurance, there's more common ground than you might imagine, because Democrats as well as Republicans are hearing from back home. And what they're hearing is from small businesses, from mid-sized businesses, from large businesses, from nonprofits, it's tough sometimes to get people to come back to work, and it's understandable. You know, according to the University of Chicago study, which no one has disputed, 68% of the people who are on UI today are making more on unemployment insurance than they are if they go back to work. That creates a disincentive. And so I do think there's a way to deal with that. As I said, there should be some understanding that there needs to be wage replacement at the federal level on top of the state level now, because unemployment is still relatively high and because there are some businesses that cannot reopen safely. But it needs to be one where you're not discouraging work, because it's good for everyone to get folks back to work, obviously including workers. That's where they get their health care for the most part. That's where they get their retirement for the most part. That's where they're going to get their training to stay up to speed. We don't want long-term unemployment here. So I think it makes a lot of sense. Certainly makes sense for the taxpayer, less unemployment insurance being paid, and also shift people over to payrolls instead. And also, of course, for our businesses, particularly small businesses that are struggling to find people right now. So I think that's one where there is common ground in terms of identifying the problem. The question is, what is the solution? Continuing the $600 is obviously not a practical solution if you want to get people back to work safely. And I think when you ask members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, they want to get people back to work safely. They just want to be sure that they get the best deal possible this week. And I think we can end up with that if we're trying to get to a solution.
Well, what is the solution on this? I mean, is it cutting it to $200 a week, as been proposed by some of the Republicans, or is it something that looks a little more akin to the plan that you told us about months ago, which would be to pay people to go back to work, essentially, getting a bonus to do that? Or is that time come and gone?
Well, Becky, I think that the best solution is to come up with a number that makes sense as to what percentage of your previous wages should be covered by unemployment. You know, typically in the states, it's a 50% number. Some have less, some have more. But no one has up to 70% of wage replacement. That's what the McConnell proposal says, that you get 70% of replacement. If Democrats are going to insist on the $600 continuing, then the return to work bonus has to be put in place. That would allow people to take $450 out of the $600 back with them to work during a 6-week period. Otherwise, again, you're going to be encouraging more unemployment, and that's not what anybody wants. So my hope is that we can go with the more sensible approach, which is to say, okay, there should still be a federal supplement. It should be significant, and it is in the McConnell proposal. You know, in the last couple of weeks, I've been around the state of Ohio and talking to businesses, and obviously hearing a lot from small businesses on this issue. You see the help wanted signs out. You see employers who are looking for 100, sometimes over 1,000 employees. Some of the larger businesses, the Ford Motor Company plant I went to, is saying they have 25% absenteeism that they attribute mostly to this. Last night, I'm on a teletown hall, and I'm hearing from someone who works in the disabilities community, works with people with disabilities, and she had the same concern. You know, they can't get people back to work, and they need the workers right now. So this is a problem that's across the board, and anybody who's back home listening to their constituents is hearing it. And again, this is not good for workers, it's not good for small businesses, and it's not good for the economy.
I hear you, but where would you place the odds in terms of what this will wind up being? Is this going to be $600 continues every week and you get a bonus for going back to work? Or is this going to be you cut that number to 70% or 75% or 80%? You cut that number and slice it and dice it in some other way. And the reason I'm pushing so much on this, Senator, is because I think it's very important for the economy overall. It's important for the market to know these things. I'd love to hear your sense of which way you think this is going to wind up. What's your best guess?
Well, Becky, first of all, we have to do something, and we have to do it by Friday. If we do nothing, because we end up in a partisan gridlock here and both sides go to their corners, the people who get hurt are the workers, because the $600 will end. There's a cliff, and we can't let that happen. So we need to do something before Friday. And frankly, I think, you know, Democrats are looking at the polling probably and saying, you know, we can try to shift the blame. That's not going to happen, because there's now a credible proposal out there saying we're willing as Republicans to provide 70% of someone's previous wages in their unemployment insurance. There may be a transition period for states to get up to speed on that, and it's during that time period where maybe there's the opportunity to have a compromise in terms of the number. The $200, you know, is roughly 70% on average. but it affects individuals differently and states differently, and that's why the 70% makes more sense ultimately, because that's a customized approach. But I think that's probably the compromise. And look, I just feel very strongly we got to resolve this on Friday. We cannot allow us to go through a period where there is no unemployment insurance going out to people. $600 to zero is not a good option. But there are, again, practical solutions here. And if people are going to stand in the way of that, then they ought to be held accountable.
Senator Portman, thank you. Always appreciate your time.
Thanks, Becky. Appreciate you guys.